It was late September 2021 when I finally decided to go back to the cabin. I hadn't stepped foot near it since the funeral. My ex-wife, Amanda, passed away 2 months before that, and even though we'd been divorced almost 5 years by then, her death felt like a cold wave that hit without warning. I didn't cry. I didn't even know how to feel. Our marriage had ended rough. Too much bitterness. Too many quiet fights that turned loud. Too many years wasted. But that cabin in northern Minnesota, way up by a cold little lake nobody cared to name, it used to mean something. We had built it ourselves, sort of. She picked the land. I poured most of the concrete. We installed the windows together. It wasn't fancy. No plumbing, just a rain barrel. Power came from a small solar panel and an old gas generator that barely worked half the time. We went there to escape everything. Her job stress, my work injuries, the noise of the town. But over time, like everything else in our life, it went quiet. She kept going there after we split. She didn't leave the cabin to me. That wasn't the point. But her sister didn't want it, and no one else in her family wanted to drive up that far to deal with it. Somehow, it ended up in my hands. I didn't even fight it. The paperwork was mailed. I signed. Suddenly, I owned a ghost from my past. It took me a few days to work up the nerve, but I drove up in my old Ford Ranger with a sleeping bag, a jug of water, some canned food, and the same anxiety I used to feel when I was still married. It was a 6-hour drive from Duluth, the last hour down a gravel road so narrow I had to pull off twice for other trucks coming the opposite way. It started raining just before I reached the final stretch. Big, cold drops that pounded the windshield and blurred the trees into smears of green and black. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I sat in the truck for 10 minutes before even opening the door. It looked the same grayish cedar siding. Same cracked porch step she kept asking me to fix, but I never did. The wind made the trees sway and groan, and I watched the motionless cabin like it was watching me back. I didn't want to go in. I wanted to drive back, but I didn't. I stepped out, grabbed my gear, and walked up. The door was unlocked. There was no reason it would be locked out here. No one ever came up this far. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and old pine. Her books were still on the shelf, a few half-burnt candles on the table, and that weird green rug she always insisted we keep even though it was ugly and never sat flat. The last time I saw this room, we were screaming at each other. I set my bag down on the floor, wiped off a chair, and sat for a long time, just looking around. The rain kept hitting the roof steady and slow. A few drops leaked through one corner just like before. She used to put a pot under it. I found the pot still sitting in the same spot. That first night, I didn't sleep. I laid in the sleeping bag with the rain pattering, eyes open, heart thudding at every small creak or rustle outside. I kept thinking about her, how she died. The report said a heart condition. She was only 42. I was 45 at the time. I thought maybe I should have seen it coming. Maybe I should have called her more, but I didn't. We stopped talking completely 2 years after the divorce. Sometimes I looked her up on social media. She never posted much. Her last post was a photo of the lake. This lake. I stayed up until the sky started turning pale, then dozed off for a few hours. The second day, I kept myself busy, stacked firewood, cleared out the dead leaves from the front steps, took a walk down to the shore. The lake was calm, but there were no birds.
No lawns.
No wind either. Everything felt too still. That night, I tried the generator, coughed twice and died. I didn't bother trying again. I used a candle to light the room and sat in the dark for hours. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint, a thud or shuffle on the porch. My gut tightened, and I reached for the old hunting knife I brought just in case. I didn't move. I just listened. Then I heard it again, a slower, dragging sound across the wood. I waited, breath held, heart hammering. every hair on my arms standing up. It stopped. I didn't go check. I just stayed there in the sleeping bag, clutching the knife, candle flickering shadows across the walls. When I finally dozed off, I had a dream about Amanda. She was sitting on the porch, just sitting there, looking at the lake, her back to me, the same way she used to. On the third day, I found the footprints, just one set, out in the wet dirt near the backside of the cabin. Bare feet, long toes, deep heel marks. At first, I thought maybe I'd stepped out without shoes during the night to pee and just forgot, but the size was off, and the spacing of the steps didn't match mine. Too narrow, too careful. I stood there staring at the prints for almost 10 minutes. The ground was soft. The prints were fresh. I looked around. No one. No movement. Just trees. I felt stupid for being scared. This wasn't a horror movie. It was just an old place, and I hadn't been sleeping right. Maybe an animal made them. Maybe they just looked human. But something about the shape stuck in my mind. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. That night, I locked the door, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I pushed a chair up under the knob. I kept the knife on my chest, the candle close, but nothing happened.
No sounds.
No movement, just the slow drip in the corner and my own breathing. In the morning, I found something strange on the table. A photograph. I didn't put it there. I was sure of it. It was a picture of Amanda and me from back when we were first building the place. Covered in mud, smiling, arms around each other. That picture had been burned years ago. I watched her throw it in the fire during a fight. I saw it crinkle and blacken. I picked it up. The edges were stained, but the image was clear. I couldn't explain it. My chest tightened. I packed my bag and left right then. On the drive back, I kept checking the mirror. No one followed. No car on the road. Just trees and fog and that long gravel stretch. I got home late and slept with the lights on. Over the next few weeks, I tried to put it out of my mind. I convinced myself it was all just my brain playing tricks. Stress, grief, regret. But then something worse happened. I got a letter, no return address, just my name in sharp, tight handwriting. Inside was a second photo. It was me standing in the cabin doorway. From the day I arrived, I was holding my bag. The image was taken from the treeline. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anything. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. I had the locks changed on my house. I added cameras, but nothing's happened. No break-ins, no more letters, no signs. Sometimes I think maybe it was someone from Amanda's past. Someone she used to know who never really left the area. Maybe someone she brought to the cabin. Maybe they didn't like me being there. Or maybe they were just watching. But other nights, I lie awake wondering if someone's still up there, living in those woods, creeping around the edges of that place. Maybe they've always been there. Maybe she knew. Maybe that's why she kept going back. The worst part is, I still think about the photo. Not the one in the mail, the first one. The one of us muddy and smiling. For a second, I almost felt something good again. And then it disappeared, just like her. I haven't burned the photos. I keep them in a drawer. Sometimes, when the night gets too quiet, I think about that final walk around the cabin. The way the trees seemed to shift, how I felt eyes on me the whole time. And I wonder if I was ever really alone. I don't know what Amanda knew, but whatever she lived with up there, I think it never left. And I won't ever go back. I was 36 the year I decided to take a full week off work and head into the wilderness alone. It was late November 2017. I'd been planning this hunting trip for months, ever since I inherited my uncle's old cabin up in northern Minnesota. It sat about 5 miles off the nearest dirt road, surrounded by miles of dense forest and thick underbrush. No neighbors, no towns nearby, just timber, creeks, and isolation. My Uncle Roger had used it as a hunting spot every fall until he passed away. The place had no electricity, no running water, just a small wood stove, a couple of cots, a table, and a narrow deck out front that overlooked a clearing. I left my place in Duluth early one morning and made the long drive north. I parked my truck where the dirt road ended, then hiked the remaining 5 miles with a heavy pack, a bolt-action rifle slung over my shoulder, and my German Shepherd, Buck, trotting along beside me. The temperature was in the low 20s. Snow had already blanketed the forest floor and hung heavy in the branches. Everything was silent, just the crunch of my boots and the sharp breath clouds in the cold air. I reached the cabin a little after noon and got to work. I swept out dead leaves from the floor, chopped some firewood from the old stack out back, and got a fire going in the stove. The place smelled like dust and cedar, felt like stepping back in time. My uncle had left everything just as it was. Ammo boxes on the shelf, old tin cans stacked near the sink, and his old hunting maps tacked to the wall. There were deer antlers hanging over the door and a hunting knife stuck into the edge of the table. That night, I cooked up a can of chili, fed Buck, and sat on the deck with a pair of binoculars as the sun dipped behind the tree line. Nothing but the sound of wind pushing through pine needles. I hadn't seen another person since I left the truck. That was part of the reason I came. I wanted to get away. Work had been stressful, and I needed space to clear my head. Over the next few days, I got into a routine. Up at dawn, hot coffee over the fire, then out into the woods with Buck. We'd track along the ridges, check for prints, and sit still for hours watching the tree line. I wasn't really out there for a kill. I just liked the quiet, the sense that I was away from everything, far from phones, bills, noise, and people. We'd come back to the cabin in the afternoon and settle in before dark. Nights dropped down into the teens. I could hear owls and the crack of branches under snow. It wasn't until the 4th day that I noticed something strange. I was coming back from a long hike up near an old dry creek bed when I noticed tracks that didn't belong to me or Buck. I stopped and stared at them for a while. They were boot prints, deep ones, heading west, crossing the same path I just walked that morning. But I hadn't seen anyone out there. They weren't old either. The snow hadn't crusted over in them yet. Someone had been walking through my area while I was away from the cabin. I followed them for a while, but they veered off into thick brush. I figured maybe it was just another hunter, though I hadn't seen any parked trucks or signs of camps nearby. Still, it wasn't impossible. The land wasn't technically private, though my uncle had leased it for decades and always said no one ever came out that far. Back at the cabin, I kept thinking about the tracks. Something about them stuck in my mind. They hadn't come from the road. They'd come from deep in the woods, like someone was already out there before me. The next morning, I found something even stranger. A cigarette, but just a few yards from the firewood pile. It wasn't mine. I don't smoke. It was fresh, barely wet from the frost. Buck sniffed it and looked toward the tree line. I walked around the cabin with my rifle, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been watching us. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every sound felt louder. Every crack outside made me sit up. Buck was restless too. Around midnight, he growled low in his throat and stared at the door. I grabbed the rifle and stood there for a long time, heart pounding in my chest, listening. Nothing.
No footsteps. No voices.
Just wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had camped out nearby and left. Maybe it was some drifter or someone passing through. But I couldn't help locking the door that night with an old rusted chain I found in the shed. The door didn't even have a proper lock, just a wood latch and that chain. The next day I stayed close. I didn't go far into the woods. I spent the afternoon sharpening my uncle's old hunting knife and chopping wood just to keep busy. At one point, I saw movement up on the ridge behind the cabin, a shadow passing between trees. I stared for a long time, but nothing came out. I even hiked up there just before dusk and didn't see any tracks. Still, the air felt different, heavier, like I wasn't alone. On the 6th day, I woke up and noticed something had changed. Buck wasn't at the foot of the bed. He always slept right there. I got up and called for him quietly. I checked the door, still locked, but the small back window, one of the ones near the stove, was cracked open. I never opened that window, and it was too high for Buck to jump out of. I went outside and found his tracks leading into the woods. Straight line, no sign of panic, but he was gone. I followed the tracks for about half a mile before they just stopped. Completely stopped, like he vanished. No blood, no drag marks, no other prints near his. I stood there for a long time, just staring into the empty snow. I went back to the cabin and sat there with the rifle on my lap until the sun went down. I didn't light a fire that night. I kept the place dark. I listened. Around 2 a.m., I heard something brush against the wall outside. A slow, deliberate movement, like fingertips dragging along the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I kept my eyes on the door until the sound faded. By the 7th morning, I'd had enough. I packed everything. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't even try to look for Buck again. I just wanted to get out. I slung the rifle, shouldered my bag, and locked the cabin as best I could. I took the trail back toward the truck. It was freezing cold, and the wind had picked up. Halfway through the hike, I noticed the tracks again. Not mine, someone else's. Fresh, just ahead of me. They matched the same boots I'd seen earlier that week. Deep prints, not running, just walking. Same pace as me. I stopped walking. Everything was dead quiet.
No birds.
No wind, just snow settling from the trees. I turned off the trail and cut through the woods, keeping low, moving fast. I didn't want to follow their path anymore. I didn't want to find out who it was. I just wanted to reach the truck. I moved through the forest like I was being hunted. Every branch felt like it snapped too loud. Every crunch of snow made me wince. When I finally saw the clearing, my truck was there. No damage. I loaded up, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. And just for a second, I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods. Just standing there, not moving. Tall figure in a dark coat. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I hit the highway, then kept going for over 2 hours before I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the land a few months later. The buyer didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any. Buck never came back. I still think about that trip sometimes. About the boot prints, the cigarette, the shadow, the man in the trees. And I keep thinking that whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They were watching me. It was the summer of 2019, and I had just turned 29. My name's Evan. I work construction most of the year, but sometimes I take off for a few weeks when things slow down. That year, I wanted to spend time alone somewhere quiet, far away from the usual noise and the people I deal with. I found a place on an old website, nothing fancy, just a short ad with a few grainy pictures of a small wooden cabin in eastern Kentucky, not too far from a forgotten town called Bunwell. The price was cheap, probably because no one wanted to stay in a place right next to an overgrown graveyard. The ad didn't say much. It mentioned that the cabin was old but still standing, had no electricity, and sat on the edge of a fenced graveyard that hadn't been used in over 50 years. I thought that part was kind of interesting. It made the place feel even more remote, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed food, tools, a small generator, and some books, then made the drive out there from Louisville. The roads got rough as I got closer. Asphalt turned to gravel, then gravel turned to dirt. Trees on both sides thickened until I was practically driving through a tunnel of green. My phone lost service 20 minutes before I even saw the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected. A slanted roof with rusted sheet metal, gray logs darkened by weather, and a small porch with a wooden chair that looked like it might snap under my weight. About 50 yards behind the cabin was the graveyard, surrounded by an old iron fence that was missing a few bars. The ground there was uneven and full of wild weeds. Some of the headstones leaned so far sideways they were almost flat. I counted at least 24 of them, maybe more. I parked near a tree, stepped out, and just stood there for a minute, taking it all in. The place was dead quiet. No car sounds, no voices, not even wind. It felt heavy, like something was pressing down on the air, but I brushed it off. That was the kind of peace I'd been looking for. The first few days were fine. I spent time cleaning up the inside of the cabin, brushing away cobwebs, fixing up some floorboards that felt loose, and putting plastic over a broken window to keep bugs out. The cabin had one main room and a tiny side area with an old cot. The smell inside was a mix of dirt, wood, and something faintly musty. I got used to it. Every day I'd make simple meals on a small gas stove, chop wood, and walk around the nearby woods. I even spent time walking the graveyard. Most of the headstones were so worn down I couldn't read the names anymore. A few had dates on them from the early 1900s. One stone, tucked in the far corner near a collapsed tree, had a carved hand pointing down with a name that had been scratched out with something sharp. I stared at it for a while but didn't think much of it. People did weird stuff with graves back then. But around the fourth night, things started to feel off. That night was humid, the kind of sticky heat that makes it hard to sleep, even with the windows open. I laid on the cot shirtless, the generator off to save fuel, listening to crickets outside. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was someone stepping on dry leaves behind the cabin. Not an animal scurrying, not wind, just a single crunch. Then silence. I sat up, heart beating faster. I grabbed my flashlight and stood by the back window, slowly moving the beam across the graveyard. Nothing moved. I figured maybe it was a deer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, I found something odd. About 20 feet from the back of the cabin, near the edge of the graveyard, I saw a small pile of stones stacked like a pyramid. I hadn't seen it there before. The stones were smooth and rounded like river rocks, and they were balanced in a way that looked too neat to be an accident. I didn't touch it. I just walked around it and went about my day. Later that evening, I noticed scratches on the side of the cabin. 3 thin, straight lines about 2 feet long, right near the window. They weren't there the day before. It looked like something sharp had dragged across the wood. I tried to convince myself it was a branch from the wind or maybe a raccoon. I didn't want to admit I was starting to get nervous. That night, I kept the generator running. I left the cabin lights on and stayed awake late reading a book, trying to ignore how quiet everything was. But sometime around 2 a.m., the lights flickered and went out. The generator was still on. I could hear it humming outside, but the inside of the cabin was pitch dark. I grabbed my flashlight again and opened the front door slowly. As soon as I stepped outside, I smelled something foul. It wasn't the usual swampy smell of the woods. It was like rotten meat and wet dirt. I followed the flashlight beam around the yard, and that's when I saw the pile of rocks was gone. Every single one had been moved. I scanned the graveyard again. My light hit something that made my stomach twist. Laying flat on one of the graves was a freshly dead squirrel, torn open at the belly, with some of the stones from the pile placed around it in a perfect circle. That was it for me. The next morning, I packed up half my stuff in the truck. I told myself I was going to leave by noon, but when I went out back to check the generator, I found it had been flipped on its side, fuel leaking out of the cap. That thing was heavy. I'd set it up on a slab of flat stone. There's no way an animal did that. I walked around the cabin to get a signal on my phone, but nothing worked. I even climbed up a small ridge near the graveyard where I thought I might get a bar, but no luck. When I came back down, I noticed fresh boot prints near the porch steps. They weren't mine. I wear thick-soled work boots, and these prints were smaller with a smooth tread. I checked the whole area, walking in circles for an hour, but found nothing else. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed inside with my hunting knife in hand, every window closed tight. I sat against the wall with my back to the door, flashlight on my lap. Hours went by and nothing happened, just silence. Then, right before dawn, I heard a soft knocking. Not on the door, not even on the windows. The knocking came from the far side of the cabin, right where the wall faced the graveyard. 3 slow taps, then another 3. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't go to look. I just sat there with my heart pounding, sweating through my shirt. When daylight finally broke, I stepped outside with my knife still in hand. The trees were calm. The sky was cloudy but bright. I walked to the back of the cabin and found nothing there.
No footprints, no marks, no rocks.
But every single headstone in the graveyard had been turned to face the cabin. That was enough for me. I didn't care about leaving anything behind. I loaded up the truck with just the basics and drove out of there as fast as I could. The road felt longer this time. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 2 hours away and finally got signal. I told the owner of the property I was done early and wired the rest of the payment just to keep him off my back. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't want to sound like a crazy person. I never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I've never felt anything like that again. Not fear, not the feeling of being watched, not the weight of silence like that. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't some curse. Someone still goes there. Someone still walks among those graves. Someone didn't want me there, and I listened. It was late October 2018 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small off-grid cabin I had rented in northern Arizona, about 20 miles outside a tiny town called Pine Ridge. I was 31 at the time, recently out of a rough relationship, and I felt like I needed space to clear my head. I'd found the cabin online. It looked decent in the photos, real bare-bones stuff. No electricity, no running water, but it had a wood stove, a hand pump for well water, and a cot. The kind of place where you could disappear for a bit. I had an old beat-up Ford Ranger I trusted just enough to make the trip. The last 10 miles were dirt roads that twisted through thick, dry pines and rocky hillsides. Cell service dropped out about halfway down the road, and by the time I reached the property, I could already feel the silence press in on me. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The cabin sat in a little clearing, surrounded by thick trees. It was about the size of a garden shed, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with an outhouse a short walk away and a collapsed barn or tool shed behind it. The roof sagged a bit in the middle, and the door had to be lifted slightly to latch right. The last time someone had stayed there had probably been months ago. I spent that first day getting a fire going inside and unpacking the canned food, jerky, and water I'd brought with me. I didn't bring much, just the basics and a bolt-action rifle for safety. Not that I expected trouble, but there were bears, mountain lions, and even the occasional wolf in that part of the state. I made a habit of keeping the rifle loaded and leaning against the wall by the door. I went to bed early that night. There wasn't anything to do after dark. The quiet felt bigger than I was used to, but it wasn't scary. Not yet. The next morning, I walked about a mile down one of the old service roads. It was overgrown and rocky, and I found the ruins of a foundation, maybe from another old cabin, all mossy and buried in fallen branches. Something about the way the forest swallowed up anything man-made gave me this weird, lonely feeling. I stood there for a while, just listening. I thought I heard a branch crack somewhere deep off to the left, but nothing else followed it, so I figured it was just a deer. That night, something changed. I had the fire going in the stove, and I was reading one of the paperbacks I'd brought. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside. Not an animal sound. It was something like the creaking of a footstep on old wood, only slower. There was nothing wooden outside though, just dirt and pine needles. I turned off my lantern and sat there in the dark, listening. Came again. A soft crunch of something pressing down on dry leaves and sticks, close to the front of the cabin. Not heavy like a bear, lighter, like a person, but slower, like they didn't want to be heard. I waited about 10 minutes, not moving. My heartbeat was in my throat. Then I got up, walked as quietly as I could to the window, and peeked through a crack in the shutter. Nothing. I stayed like that for another hour, too wired to sleep. Then finally, I laid down with my rifle next to me and tried to ignore every tiny sound the forest made. The next morning, I looked around the cabin, trying to find tracks, but the ground was so dry and covered in pine needles I couldn't tell if anything had been there or not. I told myself I was just getting in my own head. Too many nights alone, not enough distractions. That afternoon, I found a strange thing about 100 yards from the cabin. Someone or something had tied bits of twine and fur to a dead tree. They weren't decorations. They looked like small bundles of bones and feathers, dirty and old, hanging like wind chimes but without making any sound. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. They didn't look recent. They looked like they'd been there for years. Still, it made me feel sick in my stomach. I thought maybe some backwoods hunter or weirdo used this area for whatever rituals they were into. I went back to the cabin and stayed close the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep. Sometime past midnight, I heard something move around the back of the cabin. It wasn't fast, but steady. The kind of slow, deliberate movement that creeps up on you. Then something brushed against the wall. Just the sound of fabric or hair dragging lightly across the boards. I sat up on the cot and didn't move. My mouth was dry. I had my rifle across my lap, finger off the trigger but ready. Then I heard a sound I'll never forget. It was a voice, but it wasn't right. It sounded almost like someone trying to mimic a voice they'd only heard a few times. Flat, broken. The pitch wavered too much. And even though I couldn't make out words, the tone was off, like someone pretending to be human. It didn't speak again, just that one mangled attempt at sound. I didn't move till the sun came up. The next day, I packed everything I could into the truck. I planned to leave early the next morning, but I wanted to be ready just in case. I didn't hike that day. I didn't explore. I stayed near the truck with my rifle and just waited out the hours. That last night, I didn't light the stove. I didn't use my lantern. I wanted the dark to hide me. Around 3 in the morning, I saw something. I'd been sitting on the floor, wide awake, and looking through the gap in the shutter. The moon was bright, and the trees cast long shadows. I stepped into the clearing. It was tall, but it didn't stand right. Its shoulders hunched forward too far, like its spine didn't line up the way it should. The legs were long, and it took slow, awkward steps like it was testing each footfall. It stopped in the middle of the clearing and turned its head. Not its body, just its head toward the cabin. I couldn't see its face, just a pale shape where the head should be. No features. It tilted its head like it was trying to listen, then took another step forward. It didn't walk right. Its joints seemed off. Too long in some places, not enough in others. Like it had been put together from parts that didn't match. I stayed still. I didn't breathe. It walked around the cabin again, stopping at the same spot where I'd heard it the night before. Then it crouched down, slow and strange, like an animal stretching its limbs the wrong way. I must have sat there frozen for hours. When the first bit of light came through the trees, it was gone. I didn't wait. I didn't even make coffee. I started the truck and got the hell out. I didn't care about the road conditions. I just wanted to be gone. I never went back. I never told anyone about it, not in detail. I left a short review online saying there was strange activity around the area and the cabin wasn't as secure as it looked. That was it. I think it was something that wasn't meant to be seen. Not some ghost or monster or demon, just something else. Something real but wrong. Something that maybe wasn't ever supposed to look like us, but tried anyway. I don't go off-grid anymore. I still love nature, still go on hikes, but I always stay close to towns, people, and signal. Whatever I saw in those woods wasn't a story. It wasn't some fairy tale. It was there. It was real. And I think if I'd made one mistake, one noise, one flash of light, one breath too loud, it would have come inside. And that would have been the end of me. It was early September of 2014 when I got assigned to a remote section of Bitter Hollow National Forest in northern Idaho. I was 31 then, and I'd been working as a park ranger for a little over 6 years. Most of my time had been spent patrolling trails, logging forest growth, monitoring wildlife, and sometimes giving safety briefings to tourists. But this time, I got posted to a secluded ranger station, one of the old wooden cabins left over from the 70s. It sat about 35 miles from the nearest paved road, and almost no one came through that part of the forest unless they were hunting illegally or seriously lost. The cabin was small. One room, a cot, a propane stove, a wood-burning heater, a desk with some old paperwork and maps, and a small radio rig that only worked half the time. I had to bring my own water jugs and food supplies, enough to last me 2 weeks before the next rotation. That was the schedule. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. But honestly, most rangers didn't like that post. It wasn't just lonely, it felt off. One guy quit mid-rotation, said the place gave him headaches. Another just never signed up for it again. I didn't think much of it. I'd grown up alone most of my life. A quiet spot in the woods seemed like the perfect break. My first few days were peaceful. I kept track of animal movements on the trail cameras, took a few notes on tree disease, and cleared out a fallen log from one of the service trails nearby. Every night, it rained lightly for an hour or two, just enough to keep everything damp. The roof leaked in the back corner of the cabin, so I shoved an old bucket under it and let the slow dripping become part of the background noise. There was no cell signal out there, just trees, dirt, and silence. On the 5th night, the weather turned heavier. The rain came down harder, and the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls. I stayed inside most of the day, fixing a drawer that wouldn't shut and reading a few of the older reports left behind. Some of them were odd. One report from 2003 talked about unusual vehicle tracks near the Eastern Trail, but no follow-up. Another mentioned unauthorized hunting structures deeper in the woods, though it was written like whoever wrote it wasn't sure if they were recent or old. It didn't make much sense, but I chalked it up to sloppy reporting. That night I fell asleep early. The rain made it easier, but around 1:30 a.m., I woke up to something. Not a dream, not the usual wind or creaking wood. It was the unmistakable sound of boots on wet dirt. Not heavy stomping, careful steps. I sat up slowly in the cot and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the front trail or the side of the cabin. It was from the back, near the window where the roof leaked. I didn't turn on the light. I stayed still and waited. A few seconds passed. Then the sound again, closer this time. One step, another, then silence. I slid off the cot as quietly as I could, moved to the corner, and reached under the desk for the old Winchester rifle that every ranger cabin had tucked away for emergencies. It was unloaded, of course. The box of shells was in the storage bin beside the stove. I knew I couldn't make noise. I crawled across the floor, slow and steady, heart pounding, and grabbed a handful of shells. My hands were shaking. I loaded just 2 into the rifle and crept toward the window. The back window didn't have curtains, just a thin screen that didn't do much. I leaned up slowly and peered out. Nothing. No person. No animal. Just rain trickling off the roof and puddling in the mud. I waited another 5 minutes, rifle in hand, not moving. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't fall asleep after that. I sat in the wooden chair, back against the wall, watching the front door, listening for more steps. I must have sat there till the sun came up. By morning, I convinced myself it could have been a deer, maybe a coyote, maybe even a trick of my mind. Sleep deprivation does strange things, especially when you're isolated. Later that day, I walked the perimeter around the cabin, just to ease my nerves. I didn't expect to find anything, but I did. Behind the cabin, in the soft mud near the leak, I found a boot print. Not mine. I wore thick-soled ranger boots. This one had a flat pattern with a thin heel, more like something from a hiking boot or cheap work boot. It was deep, fresh, and pointed directly at the cabin wall. It hadn't been there the day before. I stood over it for several minutes, trying to make sense of it. I radioed in to base just to make a log note. The radio crackled but didn't connect. The storm had knocked out the reception. Again, I didn't like that. I checked the rest of the trail, but didn't find any other signs.
No trash.
No broken branches. No tracks heading to or from the cabin. Just that one print. I kept the rifle loaded after that. Slept light. Every small creak made me flinch. I stopped walking the trails for a day or two and mostly stayed inside. I even pushed a small table in front of the door at night just in case. For nights later, something happened again. This time, it was the front of the cabin. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like the wooden step creak. Then, the faint sound of something being dragged. Not loud, but slow. Scraping, like someone was pulling something heavy across gravel. I stood up and went to the window beside the door. Rain was falling again. Light but steady. Visibility was poor. I didn't open the door. Instead, I waited in the dark, breathing as quiet as I could. Then a loud bang. Not a knock. More like someone had hit the side of the cabin with something hard. Just once. And then silence. I raised the rifle and stepped backward, unsure if they were still out there. I couldn't call for help. No one would hear me even if I screamed. I waited another hour. Nothing more happened. When daylight came, I checked outside again. On the ground near the front step was an old metal hook, rusted, shaped like it came from a trailer hitch or some tool. I had never seen it before. It wasn't from the cabin. There were drag marks leading into the trees. I followed them for about 30 yards before they just stopped near a thick patch of pine trees. I knew someone had been out there watching the cabin, maybe more than once. I didn't know why, and that made it worse. I packed up my gear that afternoon. I was supposed to stay another 2 days, but I didn't care. I hiked 10 miles back to the ranger service road and waited near the maintenance shack until a patrol came by late that evening. I didn't explain much, just said I had gear failure and needed an early pickup. Later, I wrote an incident report, kept it simple. I didn't mention the hook or the boot print. Just unknown disturbances around cabin and possible illegal presence. No one followed up. A few months later, I learned through a coworker that an old poacher's camp had been found less than a mile from that cabin. Tarp, bones, empty cans, makeshift fire pit. Whoever it was had been living rough out there. No ID, nothing traceable. They didn't find anyone at the site, just remnants. I never went back to that cabin again. Now, over 10 years later, I still think about that night sometimes. The footsteps, the scrape, the hook, and mostly the silence that followed. Whatever or whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were, and they knew I was inside. And for some reason, they didn't come in. It was late October 2013. I was 32 years old and had taken a break from my job at a construction firm in Ohio. I needed time away from everything: city noise, office lights, people. I had bought a small piece of wooded land in West Virginia, about 100 miles from the nearest decent town. It sat just off a back road that barely had a name. There were no power lines running to it, no plumbing, and no cell service. Just trees, dirt, and silence. That's what I was after. I brought my dog with me, a 5-year-old mutt named Jasper. He was a mix of shepherd and who knows what else. Smart and alert, and more than anything, I trusted his instincts. I packed my truck with supplies, mostly tools, a tarp, lumber, a chainsaw, and just enough food to last a couple of weeks. My plan was to build a small off-grid cabin by hand. I wasn't expecting comfort, just shelter. A roof to sleep under, for walls to block the wind. That's it. I got there around noon on a Wednesday. The sky was overcast, thick clouds crawling over the hills. The land was surrounded by forest and sloped slightly down into a natural clearing where I decided to start building. There were signs of wildlife, deer tracks mostly, and a few raccoon prints near the muddy edge of a small stream. Felt right, quiet, still. I started right away, clearing brush, marking corners with stakes, laying out a simple foundation with cinder blocks I'd brought along. The first 2 days went by without much trouble. I had the floor joists down and part of the frame up. I was working slowly, carefully, and staying close to the truck just in case I needed to drive out. But then the weather turned fast. On the third night, it started raining. First it was light, just a drizzle tapping the tarp I had stretched over the frame. But by midnight, it had turned into a downpour, heavy and cold. The kind of rain that soaks you to the bone in seconds. I stayed in my truck that night, trying to get some sleep, but between the hammering rain and Jasper's constant shifting in the back seat, I barely shut my eyes. The next morning, everything was soaked. The dirt around the cabin site had turned to thick, sticky mud. Tools were damp even under the tarp, and the frame I'd been working on had started to shift a little in the soft ground. I adjusted what I could and kept working. I didn't want to waste a full day just because of a little water. It rained again the following night, and then again. Each day the skies got darker, and each night the rain seemed heavier. There was a strange weight to it all, like the forest was pressing in tighter around me. I wasn't scared, not really, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. Jasper was acting weird too. He wouldn't leave my side and would often stand facing the trees for long minutes, ears up, body stiff.
No barking.
Just staring. On the 6th night, the rain came hard. I had just finished putting up the roof beams and a temporary sheet metal cover. I was soaked and tired and planned to sleep in the cabin frame itself that night, just to see how it felt. I laid my sleeping bag on the plywood floor, wrapped myself in a blanket, and tried to ignore the sound of water drumming against the metal above. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no noise besides the rain and the occasional crack of a branch in the woods. But Jasper was growling low, the kind of growl that rumbles more in his throat than in the air. I sat up slowly and grabbed the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on and swept it around the unfinished walls. Nothing. Just damp boards, muddy boots, and my gear bag. Jasper moved to the open side of the frame, still growling. His tail was stiff, and his ears were locked forward. That got to me more than anything. He didn't growl at nothing, ever. I stepped outside with the flashlight, boots slipping a little in the mud. The rain had slowed, but everything was dripping, wet and cold. I scanned the trees, just gray shapes beyond the light. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but Jasper stayed right there at the edge of the frame, watching. I backed up and went inside. The next morning, I found tracks. Not boot prints, not animal tracks either. They were barefoot, human maybe, but they looked wrong. Toes spaced too far apart, stride too long for a normal person. They started near the edge of the stream and circled halfway around the cabin frame before disappearing into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The mud had held them perfectly, too perfect. Whoever or whatever left them must have been close while I was sleeping. I didn't panic. I didn't pack up and run like maybe I should have. Instead, I decided to work faster. I told myself it was just a hunter, maybe a hiker, someone curious, maybe drunk. That night, I moved my sleeping bag into the truck again and kept the flashlight close. I also took my hatchet and slid it under the driver's seat where I could reach it fast. Kept raining. That never stopped. On the 8th day, I finished enclosing the cabin walls. It was rough, not pretty, but it was mine. I sealed the roof best I could with more sheet metal and tacked a tarp over the door until I could build a proper one. That night, I felt better sleeping inside it. There was a strange comfort in the smell of sawdust and wet pine, like I had carved out a space that was my own, even if it was in the middle of nowhere. But again, I woke up to Jasper growling. This time it was louder, more urgent. He was standing at the tarp door, head low, hackles up. I didn't hear anything outside, but I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight and the hatchet, pulled back the tarp, and stepped out. Something was moving in the trees. I saw it just for a second. Not a person, at least not clearly. It moved fast, like it didn't care about noise or stealth anymore. Just fast. I shined the light around but couldn't see anything solid. Only the trees swaying, branches dripping. That's when I heard something behind the cabin. Something sharp and quick, like wood splintering. I ran around the side and caught a glimpse of something retreating into the woods. It was dark, so I couldn't make out a shape, but I swear it wasn't walking on two legs. Not properly. It looked like it was using its hands, too. Like it didn't move the way it was supposed to. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up with the hatchet on my lap, flashlight pointed toward the tarp. Jasper stayed awake, too. Neither of us blinked much. The next morning, the back wall of the cabin had deep gouges in it. 3 wide scratches about 4 feet off the ground. Not from an animal. Not from any tool I had. I stared at them until I felt sick. It was clear to me that whatever was coming around didn't want the cabin there. Or me. That was it. I packed everything. Took only what I needed. Left the rest. I nailed the tarp across the doorway and carved my initials into one of the front beams before I left. Just to mark it as mine. Not sure why. Maybe to make it feel like I wasn't running away. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I think about it when it rains at night, that small cabin in the middle of the forest, half finished, still standing maybe, or maybe torn apart by now. I don't tell many people about it. They'd think I was exaggerating, but I know what I saw, or at least what I felt. I still have the hatchet, still have Jasper. He's older now, slower, but every once in a while, when we're walking near the edge of the woods, he stops and stares. And that same chill runs through me, like something that once saw me out there might still remember. It was late October 2011 when I finally gave in and took a break from everything. I was 29 at the time, still trying to figure out where my life was going. My mom, Claire, had passed away the year before. She used to work as a crown agent for the government back in the UK. Nothing flashy like in movies. She didn't talk much about her work, just that she dealt with a lot of paperwork, old cases, and sometimes field logistics. She raised me on her own after we moved to Canada in the late 90s. After she passed, I felt like I needed to get away, just for a while. Too many things at once. Job stress, the funeral, going through her stuff. I thought a weekend in the woods would help me clear my head. She owned a small, weather-beaten cabin in the backwoods of northern Ontario, near a place called Kirkland Lake. I didn't even know it existed until I found the deed in her storage box after the funeral. There was a small hand-drawn map, probably hers, showing how to get there through a couple of logging roads. I figured she used it as a retreat when she wanted to be alone. Maybe during the times I thought she was working late. I didn't recognize the area, and there were no coordinates on the map, just old directions scribbled in pencil. It took me 4.5 hours to drive up there, not counting the slow ride through the rough, washed-out dirt roads once I got off the highway. The cabin was old but solid. It sat about 50 yards from a narrow creek that ran behind a dense wall of spruce trees. There was a stack of firewood by the porch, dry enough to use. No electricity, just a wood stove, 2 small windows, and a steel lock on the door. The inside had the same smell most untouched cabins have: mice, mold, wood dust, and something dry and metallic. I brought some canned food, a flashlight, matches, and my old sleeping bag. There was a rusty cot pushed against the far wall, and I set up my bag on top of it. I didn't plan to stay longer than 2 nights. The first night was fine, cold but quiet. I kept the wood stove going and stayed under my bag most of the night. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a banging noise. It sounded like something hitting the front steps. I waited a while, listening. Came again, louder, like wood cracking. But then it stopped. I thought maybe a branch or some animal. I didn't bother checking. It was probably nothing, I told myself. The next morning, I found 2 small dents in the steps, fresh ones. Not from a branch. Something heavy, maybe a boot, but there were no footprints, just flattened moss and a small patch of dried mud by the bottom step. That part made me uneasy because it hadn't rained in a few days. Where did the wet mud come from? I tried not to think too much about it. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, collecting small twigs, looking for a good fishing spot, just trying to feel normal again. The air was cold but clear. When I came back in the afternoon, I noticed something strange in the dirt behind the cabin. A rectangular patch had been disturbed, about 2 feet wide, for feet long, like something had been dug up recently or maybe buried. The soil was darker than the rest around it. I didn't have a shovel and the ground was frozen an inch deep. I decided to leave it alone. Later that evening, I started going through some old drawers inside the cabin. Most of it was empty, dusty notebooks, faded maps, broken pens. But behind a loose panel on the bottom shelf, I found a sealed brown envelope. It had my mom's handwriting on it. It just said, "If something happens, don't trust anyone. Not even the ones who say they knew me." That sentence hit me hard. I just sat there for a while, holding it. There were papers inside. Mostly names, places, and dates I didn't understand. Some were blacked out with thick marker lines. But one thing stood out. A printed satellite photo with a red circle over a forest area not far from the cabin. A few pages down, there was a handwritten note with coordinates that matched that red circle.
No explanations.
Just numbers. I shouldn't have gone looking, but I did. Took me about 40 minutes to reach the spot, hiking northeast through thick brush. The ground rose a little and then I found a flat clearing. In the middle of it was a buried metal hatch, square, covered with leaves, almost invisible. I cleared it with my boot and opened it. The smell that came out wasn't good. It smelled like wet rust, oil, and something dead. Inside was a narrow metal ladder that went down maybe 12 feet. I climbed down carefully with my flashlight. The bottom led into a short hallway, metal walls, narrow enough that I had to turn sideways in some parts. There were no lights, no markings, just rusted surfaces and stale air. At the end of the hallway was a small room. There were crates inside, some open, some sealed. I opened one. Inside were old files, sealed bags with sample tags, and old Polaroid photos of places, barren fields, burned cars, people with their faces scratched out in ink. That's when I realized whatever my mom was part of wasn't just desk work. This place wasn't abandoned by accident. It was hidden. I didn't take anything with me. I climbed out, covered the hatch again, and walked back fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. It was almost dark by the time I reached the cabin again. I locked the door and stacked a chair against it. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound outside made me jump. There was something too quiet about that forest. Not natural quiet, controlled quiet. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard something move outside. Not a branch, not a raccoon. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I turned off my flashlight and just laid still. The steps stopped behind the cabin. Then I heard a slow, dragging noise, like metal scraping over wood. Couldn't breathe right. My mouth went dry. I waited maybe 30 minutes before I dared to move. I didn't hear anything after that, but I stayed still till the sky began to turn blue. When I finally opened the door, the ground was disturbed again. The patch behind the cabin was fully dug up now. A small, empty hole about 3 feet deep. But what scared me most was what was lying next to it. An old black Crown Agent ID card. My mom's picture on it, torn in half. I left that place within an hour. I didn't even pack properly. Just threw everything in the trunk and drove until I reached the highway. I didn't stop until I was back home in Sault Ste. Marie. I tried to forget the whole thing, but every now and then I'd see a car parked too long across the street or someone looking at my apartment building from the sidewalk. No one ever came close, but I always felt watched after that. I burned the papers a week later, kept the envelope though. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed to keep something from her. Something that told me I wasn't losing my mind. My mom had secrets, big ones. I never asked her questions when she was alive, and now it was too late. I never went back to that cabin. I still have the key, but I don't think I'll ever use it again. There's one thing I'm sure of now: whatever she was involved in, it didn't end when she died. And whoever was out there that night, they weren't lost hikers. They knew exactly where they were. They were looking for something, or someone. And for a little while, I think they thought it might have been me. And I think that's the only reason I'm still here. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to get away from everything. I'd been living in Phoenix for years, working long shifts as a mechanic in a hot, loud garage, and I just needed some real silence for once. I was 33 back then, single, no kids, no one to really check in with. I liked it that way. So when a buddy of mine from high school offered me his late uncle's old cabin up in northern Idaho for a few weeks, I didn't hesitate. Said the place was basic, no Wi-Fi, no plumbing, no electricity unless you ran the old generator. But it was quiet, secluded, and surrounded by forest. That was all I needed to hear. I packed up my truck, threw in a cooler full of food, a few jugs of water, a cot, my sleeping bag, a hatchet, and my .38 revolver I kept for bear country. I left Phoenix early, took 2 days to drive up through Utah and then across the mountains. The roads got worse the closer I got. By the time I turned onto the dirt trail that led to the cabin, my truck was bouncing and rattling like it was going to fall apart. The cabin sat about 10 miles off the nearest paved road, tucked back in a thick stretch of pine and spruce. It was small, just one room and a tiny covered porch out front, but it looked solid, if a bit weathered. There was an old metal chimney pipe poking out the roof, a busted rocking chair on the porch, and the dry scent of pine needles in the air. I spent the first day just settling in. I swept out dead leaves and mouse droppings, fixed a broken shutter, and patched a crack in the roof with a spare tarp I'd brought. Inside was dusty but not trashed, bare wood floor, a potbelly stove, a few old chairs, and a rickety table. There were some canned goods in a corner cabinet that had probably been there since the 90s, but I didn't trust any of it. I ate from my own stash. The nights were colder than I expected, even in July. I'd lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind push through the trees, sometimes hearing branches pop or an animal shuffle outside. But it wasn't scary. Not then. It was the kind of silence you don't realize you've been craving until you have it. No engines, no phones, no people. Just the woods and the fire. By the third day, I'd slipped into a routine. I'd wake up with the sun, make some instant coffee with boiled water on the camp stove, and then go hiking through the woods with my backpack. I brought a small hunting knife and my revolver just in case. I wasn't trying to find anything special. I just liked walking without a destination. That routine held until about the 6th night. Started small. I was sitting out on the porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the hills when I noticed something. About 100 yards out, past the clearing, a shape moved between the trees. I squinted. It wasn't big, maybe a deer or something, but it wasn't acting like one. It didn't dart or graze. It just stood behind the trees, half covered, not moving. I waited, staring at it for a long time, but eventually it blended back into the woods and I went inside. I told myself it was nothing, but the next morning, I found something odd. Near the side of the cabin, by the window, there were tracks. Not animal tracks, boots, human. I looked closely and followed them for a few yards, but they stopped abruptly near the tree line, like whoever it was had stepped backwards to erase their trail. I stood there a while, trying to piece it together. I hadn't heard anything in the night.
No footsteps.
No car, just silence. I spent the rest of that day uneasy. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the tree line every few minutes. I carried the revolver on my hip even when I was inside. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, soft movement in the leaves. I kept checking the windows, the door. Nothing. Then on the 8th day, I went out for a short hike in the morning, and when I came back, the front door was open. Not all the way, just cracked. I was sure I had latched it. I stood there a long time before stepping inside. Nothing looked out of place. My cooler was still shut, the bedroll untouched, but the air felt different, like someone had been breathing in it. I stepped quietly over to the window and looked out. The woods were still. I didn't see anything. I checked behind the cabin. No one, but there were more boot prints this time, closer to the back. I didn't go hiking that day. I kept inside, pacing, staring out each window every 10 minutes. The revolver was always in my hand. That night, just after midnight, I heard the doorknob rattle. It wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate twist. I sat up in the dark, heart slamming in my chest. I didn't move, just listened. The door creaked slightly, like it was being nudged. I stood up and cocked the revolver. I didn't speak. I didn't warn whoever it was. I just waited. The sound stopped. I crept toward the door and leaned close to it, trying to listen for breathing or footsteps. Nothing. I yanked the door open and pointed the gun out into the night. Nothing there. No one. But in the dirt, just in front of the porch, were 2 fresh footprints. That was it for me. The first light, I started packing. I didn't care how far I had to drive or if I had to sleep in my truck that night. I just wanted out of those woods. But before I could finish loading up, I noticed something even worse. The tire on the front passenger side was slashed. Not just flat, cut clean open. I stood there staring at it for a long time, and I remember this sick, hollow feeling growing in my gut. I checked the rest. 2 more tires had been slashed. My spare too. Whoever had been watching me didn't just want to scare me. They wanted to trap me there. I went back inside and locked the door. I spent that day in the cabin, peeking out through the cracks in the boarded windows. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I just waited, holding the revolver in my lap, every muscle in my body tight. The forest was too quiet.
No birds.
No movement. When it got dark, I didn't turn on the lantern. I sat in the corner of the room, hidden in the shadows, listening. I didn't hear footsteps that night, but I knew someone was out there. The next morning, I started walking. I grabbed my pack, the revolver, and just left everything else behind. I hiked the 10 miles back to the paved road, checking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to hear running footsteps behind me. But I didn't. When I finally got signal on my phone, I called a tow truck company from the nearest town and told them where the cabin was. The driver didn't seem surprised. When he arrived, he took one look at the tires and said, "You ain't the first." Turns out, there'd been reports of break-ins and vandalism in that area for years. A couple people had gone missing, too, but nothing was ever proven. Some said it was squatters. Others thought it was a local who didn't like outsiders. No one really knew. I never went back for my stuff. The truck got towed, repaired, and I drove it straight back to Arizona. Even now, years later, I think about that week up in the Idaho woods, about how close someone got to me, about how they watched me, waited, followed me. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never without checking the tires before I fall asleep. It was the summer of 2012. I had just turned 38. Work had been running me down hard that year. Endless shifts, paperwork, stress piling up like bricks. I lived in San Diego back then, and I'd started feeling boxed in. The traffic, the noise, the routine. I needed a break from everything, something far away from people and buildings and emails. So I took 3 weeks off, packed up my truck, and drove up north through California into Oregon, just driving without much of a plan. About 5 days in, I found this spot near La Pine, Oregon. Tall pines, thick woods, and barely any signal. I came across a little cabin while driving a dirt road that didn't even have a name on the GPS. It looked old, but not abandoned, just forgotten. It sat about 30 yards back from the dirt trail, with a small creek running behind it. I figured maybe it belonged to a hunter or some local, but it looked empty. No tire tracks, no footprints. The cabin had a chain on the door, but it was rusted through and snapped clean when I pulled at it. Inside was dusty, but not wrecked. One old table, a wood stove, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, and some hooks in the walls where tools might have once hung. Nothing weird.
No carvings, no strange symbols.
Just a bare-bones cabin that hadn't seen use in years. I decided I'd stay there for a few nights. I had my sleeping bag, canned food, a cooler, a folding chair, and everything else I'd need. I wasn't planning to rely on anything inside the place. I just needed a roof and silence. The first 2 nights were peaceful. I'd go for walks, cook near the fire pit I built out back, read a bit, then go to sleep. One morning, I woke up to some deer passing through the trees, just outside the cabin. That was the kind of quiet I'd been looking for. But on the 3rd night, things shifted. It started with a sound. I was lying in my sleeping bag, half asleep, when I heard something moving outside the cabin. It was subtle at first, just a branch snap or maybe an animal stepping on dry leaves. I didn't think much of it. There were raccoons and coyotes all over these woods. But then it happened again, louder and closer. I sat up slowly and turned off my lantern. I listened. There it was again, something crunching the dirt outside. Slow, deliberate steps, not a 4-legged animal. It sounded like a person walking, but not with purpose. The steps would pause for long seconds at a time, then start again. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the door. Nothing. I didn't want to make noise, so I sat still and just listened. After a few minutes, the steps moved away. I figured maybe it was someone passing through. Maybe a hiker who had no idea the cabin was occupied. Still, I locked the door from inside with a bungee cord and a carabiner clipped through the latch hole. In the morning, I walked the perimeter and found no footprints. The ground was too dry. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I'd imagined the steps. Maybe it was an animal dragging something. I shook it off and stayed. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every hour, my ears sharp to every noise. But nothing came. By sunrise, I was exhausted but relieved. Still, something had settled into my gut like a weight. I felt like I was being watched. Not the usual I'm alone in the woods nerves. This was heavier. I thought about leaving but told myself I'd stay one more night. Just one more. I didn't want to pack up over a little paranoia. So I tried to enjoy the day. Went down to the creek, cleaned my pan, took a quick wash in the cold water, ate lunch on a flat rock under the sun. That helped calm me down. But something was off again that evening. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that froze me in place. My folding chair, which I had left by the fire pit, was now leaning against the cabin wall. I hadn't touched it since the day before. I knew that for sure. The chair was heavy and didn't blow over easily. And even if it had, it wouldn't have landed standing upright, leaned neatly against the wall like that. I looked around the woods, but everything looked the same. Quiet. Still. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Nothing had been moved. My stuff was untouched. I checked my gear, my cooler, my food, everything was there. But now I was on edge. I locked the door again and slid my cooler in front of it. That night, I stayed awake as long as I could. I had my flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other. I didn't plan on using it, but having it in my grip helped steady me. Around 1:30 in the morning, the sounds came again. Same as before, crunching leaves, slow steps circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The steps stopped right outside the door this time. Then I heard something scrape the wood. Not banging, just slow dragging along the outside wall, like fingers or a stick. Then silence. I stayed frozen like that until morning. When the sun came up, I finally opened the door. No one was there, of course, but on the wall next to the door frame, there were scratches in the wood. Not deep, not carved, just fresh scrapes, like something hard had been dragged against it. I walked a wide circle around the cabin, scanning the ground, the trees, everything. Still no footprints, no gear left behind, no clues. That was it for me. I packed up immediately, stuffed everything into the back of my truck, and didn't stop driving until I reached a small gas station off the highway about 2 hours south. When I got there, I noticed something else that made my stomach turn. Stuck to the back of my tailgate, barely visible under the dust and dirt from the road, was a single fingerprint. It was smudged, like someone had placed their hand on it and then slid it down slightly. I hadn't noticed it when I packed, and I sure as hell didn't put it there. It was too high to be from the ground and too fresh to be old. I drove all the way back to San Diego that day without stopping for more than gas. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over everything, those slow steps, the chair, the scratches, that print. I didn't see a face. I didn't catch anyone in the act. But I knew what I felt out there. Someone was watching me. Someone came close. Too close. And whoever it was, they were smart enough not to get caught. Careful, quiet, patient. I thought about reporting it, but what would I say? I stayed in an old cabin I found in the woods and someone creeped around at night? No crime. No proof. No evidence. Just fear. Since then, I've never gone camping alone again. I still hike. I still love nature. But now, whenever I hear a twig snap in the woods, my whole body tenses up. I remember the sound of those footsteps. Slow. Waiting. Measuring. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some old legend or wild animal. It was a person, and that's what scared me most. I was 41 years old the summer I decided to get out of Chicago for a while. The city had been grinding me down for years, and after my divorce 2 years earlier, Everything just felt too loud and too fast. I had some leftover savings, and since I was working freelance IT contracts from home, I figured I could take a long break somewhere quiet. I rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the forests of northern Idaho, near the Selkirk Mountains. It was August 2023. I planned to stay out there for at least 3 weeks.
No neighbors.
No cell service. No city noise. Just me and my dog, Cooper, a 6-year-old chocolate lab with a calm temperament and sharp instincts. The cabin was about 25 miles from the nearest town, and getting to it meant driving 2 hours through winding roads, followed by a slow 15-minute crawl down a gravel path barely wide enough for my truck. It was built in the 70s, all cedar logs and hand-cut stone, tucked between thick trees and about 200 yards from a slow-moving creek. There was no electricity, just a propane stove and a couple solar panels for minimal lighting.
No Wi-Fi, obviously.
That was the point. It was peaceful that first week. I split wood, hiked with Cooper, cooked over the fire pit, and read old books in the evenings with a lantern. The air out there was crisp even in summer, the kind that smelled like pine and earth. Cooper would run around in the woods but always came back when I whistled. He'd sleep near the porch at night, his ears always twitching at distant forest sounds. On the 8th day, things started to feel strange, but not in any obvious way. It started with the feeling that something was watching us. I'd be walking along the trail or chopping wood, and I'd feel that weight on the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. Cooper, who normally trotted ahead or sniffed every tree along the path, had become more alert. He'd stop and stare into the woods, sometimes growling very quietly. The fur on his back raised just a little. It wasn't like him. He wasn't a nervous dog, but I told myself it was probably some deer or maybe a mountain lion passing through. Then I found the tracks. 2 mornings later, I was walking toward the creek with Cooper at my side. There's a muddy area near the water where animals often leave prints, and I noticed something unusual there. Human footprints, barefoot, deep impressions like someone heavy had been walking through in the night. They weren't mine. I always wore hiking boots. These were longer, almost flat-footed, like whoever made them had been moving slow. The weirdest part was how the tracks came from the woods, stopped at the creek, and then vanished. There were no returning prints, just a straight path from the trees to the water and nothing else. That evening, I moved my gear inside. Until then, I'd been keeping firewood, water jugs, and some tools outside near the porch. I didn't want to take chances, not with some barefoot guy possibly wandering through. I also started locking the cabin door at night, even though the old bolt felt kind of flimsy. Cooper was jumpy again that night. He didn't want to leave the porch, even to relieve himself. His ears were pinned back, and his body was low to the ground. He just kept facing the tree line and growling softly. By the 10th night, I couldn't sleep right. I kept waking up, listening. The wind through the trees sounded like whispers. At one point, I swore I heard something step onto the porch. Not an animal, it was too heavy. Creaked once, then went silent. I sat there in the dark with my heart pounding, holding the hatchet I kept near the bed. Cooper was standing up too, quietly pacing near the door, tail low, sniffing the air. In the morning, I found that one of the jugs I'd left by the window had been moved, just a few feet, but I knew where I left it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Something had been out there. I thought about leaving, but curiosity and stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I'd install a camera system next time, something solar-powered. For now, I started marking the area. I tied some small tin cans to string and hung them between trees as makeshift trip alarms. They'd rattle if anything passed through at night. That night was cold and very quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of cans clattering. Not one set, but 3, all from different directions. My heart started pounding immediately. I grabbed my flashlight and the shotgun I kept in a case under the bed. Cooper was up, low growling again, pacing like he didn't know where to go first. I didn't open the door. I waited. I shut off the lantern and stood still, just listening. Crunch. Something stepped on the gravel path outside the porch. Slow, dragging steps, then silence. I stayed there for hours. I didn't sleep at all. Around 4:30 a.m., I finally opened the door with the gun ready. Nothing. Just the trees and a few cans on the ground, lines snapped or pulled down. No tracks, no animals, no person, just that same quiet. At sunrise, I walked the perimeter. I found more prints, still barefoot, still coming toward the cabin but never away. Cooper didn't bark, but he didn't leave my side either. I packed most of my gear that morning. I wasn't staying another night. Something was out there that didn't want to be seen, and I wasn't going to play games. I left before noon, but before I got in the truck, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it, up in the trees about 50 yards from the cabin. A man, or what looked like one. He was standing behind a tree, just enough of him visible to know he was tall, lean, and not wearing a shirt. His skin looked pale against the bark. He didn't move, didn't flinch when I looked at him. He just stood there watching. I didn't call out. I didn't try to take a picture. I just got in the truck, Cooper in the passenger seat, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached Sandpoint. I didn't file a report. I didn't have a face, a name, or anything but a vague description of someone who maybe didn't want to be found. I haven't been back since. I canceled the second part of the rental and had the rest of my gear shipped by a local service. That was almost 2 years ago now. Cooper's older, grayer around the muzzle. I think about that place sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night. The silence, the tracks, that pale figure behind the tree. The way the prints always came toward the cabin but never showed any signs of leaving. It makes me wonder how long he'd been watching, how close he ever got to the windows at night while I was asleep, or thought I was asleep. I didn't go out there to be scared. I went to heal, to breathe, to find quiet again. But sometimes, the deeper you go into silence, the more it shows you things you didn't expect. Things that never wanted to be found in the first place. Now, whenever I plan a trip, I make sure there are neighbors within shouting distance. I still like the woods. I still like the quiet. But I don't go that deep anymore. Once was enough. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to head out to the northern woods of Maine, somewhere near the border with Canada. I was 32 at the time, single, and going through a rough patch in life. I had recently quit my job at a logistics company in Boston. Everything just felt heavy. City noise, crowded trains, fake smiles and elevators. I needed to get away for a while and be in a place where nobody could reach me. No phones, no schedules, no one knocking on my door. Just me, the cold, and the trees. I had found the cabin by accident. I was going through old state land records online and found mention of an old ranger station that had been decommissioned back in the early 90s. Most people didn't even know it was still there. It sat inside a patch of state land nobody maintained anymore, off a disused dirt road that had been swallowed up by moss and roots. No signs, no map markings, just coordinates and a short blurb in a PDF file. That was exactly what I needed. I packed light, just essentials. A good knife, a hunting rifle, some canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, extra batteries, a wind-up radio, and a fire-starting kit. I had my old Toyota Tacoma and drove 6 hours north, the last hour being slow as hell due to the overgrown dirt road. My tires crunched over branches and wet leaves, and I had to stop twice to chainsaw fallen trees out of the way. It was mid-afternoon when I finally found the place. The cabin looked worse than I expected. The front porch was caved in on one side. One of the windows was shattered, and vines had crept in through the cracks. The roof sagged. The logs that made up the walls were graying and dry, with patches of moss and green slime in the shaded spots. The chimney was cracked all the way down. The door had no lock, just rusted hinges barely holding on. But it was standing, and inside it was dry. I swept out a pile of leaves and raccoon droppings from the main room, then unrolled my sleeping bag in the back corner where the floorboards seemed the least rotted. There was an old wood stove in the center, and I cleaned it out the best I could. I gathered some kindling from the surrounding woods and got a fire going. The smoke drifted up through the chimney slowly, but it didn't choke the room. That was good enough for me. By the time it got dark, I'd eaten a can of beef stew and was lying back on my sleeping bag, listening to the wind rattle the trees outside. The forest here was different, heavier. I'd camped alone many times before, but something about this patch of woods felt off. I couldn't hear the usual night sounds.
No owls. No insects.
Just wind and an odd crack now and then, like distant branches snapping one by one. I chalked it up to old nerves. That night I slept lightly. Every time I drifted off, some small sound woke me. A soft tap, like something brushing the walls. The wind was picking up hard by 2 a.m., and at one point, I swear I heard what sounded like someone stepping on the porch. But when I sat up and held my breath, there was nothing, just the creaking of wood shifting with the wind. I stayed awake until dawn. The next day, I decided to scout the area around the cabin. I had a handheld GPS with me, and I dropped a pin where the truck was parked just in case I lost my bearings. The woods were thick, and after walking less than a mile, I came across something strange. A pile of stones, small, round ones, stacked in a rough pyramid. It was about waist-high, placed right in the middle of a clearing with no trails leading to it. It didn't look natural. I didn't touch it. I just took note of it and moved on. I hiked for a few more hours, mostly uphill, until I reached a bluff that gave me a decent view of the tree canopy. Nothing but endless forest in every direction. No smoke from distant chimneys. No glint from roads. No plains overhead. Just trees. When I got back to the cabin that evening, something felt wrong. The door was open. I was sure I had pulled it shut when I left. There was no wind strong enough to swing it open. I stepped inside carefully, rifle in hand, and scanned the room. My sleeping bag had been moved. Not a lot, just enough that it looked off. My food bag was unzipped, but nothing was taken. I checked the perimeter, made sure no animals had clawed through anywhere. Nothing, but I still felt watched. That night, I barely slept again. I kept the fire going low and sat with my back against the wall, facing the door. Every 30 minutes or so, I'd hear that same tapping on the outside. Soft, too soft for wind, and always in the same spot right near the back window. On the third day, I woke up to find boot prints outside the cabin. Not mine. They were fresher than mine and larger. I wear size 10s. These were maybe size 12 or 13. Deep impressions like whoever made them was heavy. They came up from the woods, circled the cabin, and then vanished behind a ridge. I followed them for maybe 100 yards until they disappeared into some thick brush. That's when I started thinking about leaving, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid. Just a hunter maybe, someone else exploring. Maybe some local who knew about the place and was just curious. Still, that night, I stacked a few rusty chairs from the back shed in front of the door and wedged a metal pole against the window frame. I kept my rifle next to my sleeping bag, safety off. Around 3 a.m., the tapping came again. This time, I heard it shift. It started at the back window, then slowly moved around the wall to the side, then to the front. One step at a time.
Top, purser.
Then again. It circled the entire cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fire had burned down low, and the inside was nearly pitch black. I could hear my own heartbeat, and every little creak in the wood felt like thunder in my ears. Then it stopped. No footsteps walking away, just silence. In the morning, I found new prints again. Bigger, heavier, the same boots, same pattern. This time, the prints stopped just a foot away from the wall near where I had slept. That was it for me. I packed up in under 20 minutes. I left some of my heavier gear behind, cans, a tarp, extra firewood. I didn't care. I wanted out. I marched straight back to my truck, glancing behind me every few minutes. When I reached it, I almost broke the key trying to get it into the ignition. The truck fired up, and I peeled out of there so fast I clipped a small pine on the way out. I didn't stop driving until I hit the first gas station on the highway. When I got home, I couldn't sleep for nights. I kept thinking about those footprints, that slow circling sound, the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just some messed up loner in the woods playing mind games. Maybe some off-grid guy who didn't want anyone near his land. But deep down, it didn't feel like that. It felt like whoever it was, they weren't trying to scare me. They were testing me, seeing how long I'd last, waiting for something. I never went back. I didn't tell anyone the location. I deleted the GPS coordinates. I even threw out the state record files I'd printed. Sometimes, when I'm out in my backyard late at night, I still get that feeling. That same cold breath on the back of my neck. Like someone's out there, watching from the trees. I never saw a face, never heard a voice. But I know someone was out there, and they weren't passing through. They lived there, and they wanted me gone. It was the summer of 2016. I had just turned 34 and needed a break from everything. I'd been working too many late nights, getting little sleep, and slowly turning into someone I didn't even recognize. I used to be calm, patient, careful. But lately, I had grown impatient and angry over little things. One morning, I snapped at a coworker over a missing stapler and realized I needed to get away before I lost it for real. I drove out to a remote part of Oregon where I'd rented a small, off-grid hunting cabin through a site that specialized in no-service retreats. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors for miles. Just me, some canned food, a fishing rod, a few books, and an old .22 rifle for peace of mind. The guy who rented it to me left the keys in a padlocked box under the porch and gave me the combo. He said the cabin hadn't been used in a while, but everything should work. It was cheap and I didn't ask questions. I just wanted peace. The dirt road to the place was full of potholes and barely wide enough for my truck. Branches scraped the sides, and the deeper I got, the more cut off I felt. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt like I'd driven into another world. It was a small wooden structure, single story, dark brown with an overhanging tin roof. Moss crept up one side. The air was thick with pine and damp earth. A stream ran behind the cabin, just beyond a slope of sharp rocks. It was silent except for birds and the occasional rustling of wind through trees. The first couple days were exactly what I needed. I went for walks, cooked basic meals, and slept like a log. I read most of the day or sat outside listening to nature. There was something about the silence that made me feel reset. The weather was warm but not unbearable. At night it got cooler, and I slept under a thick wool blanket on a creaky old bed that smelled like dust and cedar. On the third night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. I didn't know why. It wasn't a sound that woke me. I didn't hear anything at all. That's what felt strange. The bugs had stopped. No wind, no creaking trees. It was dead quiet, and that silence was so loud it put me on edge. I stayed still for a while, ears straining. I felt like I was being watched, though I knew that was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I got up and looked out the window beside the bed. Nothing but black trees and the pale outline of the stream glinting in moonlight. I lay back down, but I didn't fall asleep. I don't remember when I did. I just remember feeling tense for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin near the back window. They weren't mine. I checked the tread against my own boots. Different shape, deeper, wider. Someone had walked up close to the cabin during the night. It had rained a little before sunrise, so the prints were fresh. I stared at them for a while, my stomach twisting. They led in from the woods and circled around the window, then disappeared back into the trees. That was it. No trash, no damage, no other signs. Just someone walking around my cabin while I slept. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call anyone, no service. I figured maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe someone who thought the place was abandoned. I told myself that and forced myself to believe it. Still, I started keeping the rifle closer. I made sure the doors were locked every night and placed a chair under the knob just in case. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard a thump outside. Not loud, but clear. I sat up, heart pounding, and stayed still. Then another thump, like a foot hitting the bottom step of the porch. Then silence again. I didn't move. I waited in the dark, watching the bedroom door, the rifle across my lap. I stayed like that until the sun came up. When I finally opened the door and looked around, nothing was out of place. But again, boot prints, this time on the porch steps. Whoever it was had walked right up to the door. That day, I packed up my stuff. I'd planned to stay a week, but it was time to go. I loaded the truck by noon. Before I left, I walked around the cabin one last time just to see if I missed anything. That's when I saw the tree, about 50 feet back in the woods, just far enough you couldn't see it from the cabin at night. It was a large pine, tall and thick. Someone had hammered 3 long nails into the side of it at eye level. Hanging from one of the nails was a cheap plastic bag tied shut with twine. I don't know what made me open it. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear. I walked over and untied it. Inside were 3 items: a dirty sock, a torn photo of a dog with the name Lucy written in marker on the back, and a crumpled paper with my name on it. Not my full name, just the short version, the one only close friends or family ever used. I hadn't told that name to anyone when I booked the cabin. The site only had my full legal name. I stood there holding the paper, not moving. The woods felt darker all of a sudden. I looked around slowly, but everything was still, quiet again, that dead silence. I put the paper back in the bag and tied it shut, then left it hanging there. I walked fast back to the cabin, slammed the door, and started the truck. I didn't waste time. I drove back down the rough trail, scraping the truck even more than before. Every branch sounded louder. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't stop until I hit the main road almost an hour later. I didn't stop again until I was back in Bend, Oregon, parked in a gas station lot with people all around me. Back home, I changed all my passwords, checked my ID, dug into my email and messages to see if I'd posted that name anywhere recently. Nothing. I even asked a few friends if they had ever told anyone about my plans. No one had. It still doesn't make sense to me. I didn't report it. What would I say? That I found a boot print and a bag in the woods with a note? There wasn't really anything they could do. No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. Just someone watching me, knowing things they shouldn't. I never went back. I deleted the booking account and sold the rifle. I stopped going off-grid alone. I tried to tell myself it was just some creepy local messing around, but I don't fully believe that. Not when they knew my name. Not when they walked right up to the cabin night after night without me ever hearing them. Now, I still take trips, still camp sometimes, but only with people I trust. I never go alone anymore, and I never stay in a place where I can't make a call. I still think about that night sometimes, about what would have happened if I hadn't left, if I'd stayed one more night, if I'd opened the door that second time I heard the steps. I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small farm cabin that used to belong to my Uncle Harold. He passed away a few years before, and the property had just been sitting untouched ever since. The place was way out in the countryside near a town called Emporia in southern Kansas, about a 3-hour drive from where I lived in Overland Park. I was 32 then, working a lot of overtime at a landscaping company, and just needed to get away for a while, be by myself and have some quiet. The cabin sat in the middle of about 40 acres of mixed pasture and woods. The land was surrounded by rusted wire fences, and it backed up to a dried-out creek bed and some thick trees. There was no cell service out there, no neighbors close by, just open sky, fields, and old dirt roads. I had been to the cabin only once before as a kid, maybe around 11 or 12, but I hardly remembered anything about it. It was a simple one-room structure, probably built in the 60s. Wood walls inside and out, a little metal sink with a water pump, a cast iron stove, and an old cot pushed up against the far wall under the only window. There was a shed behind the cabin and an old windmill that didn't spin anymore. The place smelled like dust, dry wood, and rust. I brought a few supplies: canned food, bottled water, a battery-powered lantern, and a hunting knife I'd had for years but never actually used. The first 2 days were quiet, peaceful even. I woke up early, took walks across the field, sat on the porch with coffee from a small propane burner I brought, and watched the sun rise over the grass. Nights were cold but still. Crickets filled the air with sound, and coyotes yipped far off toward the tree line. It felt like what I needed. No traffic, no people, no noise except the wind and animals. On the third night, I woke up sometime after midnight to a strange metallic clanging sound. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and echoed a bit. It didn't scare me at first. I figured maybe it was the wind rattling something loose on the shed or the old windmill. I lay there on the cot, listening. The sound came again, clang, then another pause, clang. Then it stopped. I fell back asleep eventually, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning, I checked the windmill. Nothing seemed loose. I checked the shed too. The lock was still on, though it hung slightly crooked. I didn't remember it being like that before. I opened the shed and looked around. Inside, it was packed with old tools, broken wooden chairs, rusted nails, and a stack of wood logs. There were spiderwebs everywhere, and the air was thick with that sharp smell of old oil and rot. I shut it again and made sure the latch was firm. That night, I went to sleep with the knife on the floor next to the cot. I didn't feel scared, just cautious. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but something didn't sit right with me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a clang. It was a soft crunching sound, like dry grass being stepped on. I sat up slowly and stayed completely still. My heart started pounding. The sound wasn't far, just outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I listened. The crunching stopped. Then slow steps again. Just a couple. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, waiting, holding my breath. I didn't dare shine the lantern or even look toward the window. Eventually, I must have sat there for nearly half an hour before I finally laid back down. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was trying to come up with explanations. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a coyote, anything. But deep down, I knew the sound of 2 legs walking. That wasn't an animal. I decided to check around the cabin just to be sure. I walked the full perimeter. The grass around the porch had a few flattened patches that could have been anything. I found nothing clear. But when I got to the side with the window, my only window, I noticed something odd. There were faint smudges on the glass, like fingerprints but streaked, almost like someone had pressed their face against it, maybe a nose or cheek, and slid off. I wiped it clean and didn't want to think about it. That afternoon, I debated packing up and heading back early, But I had told myself I'd stay the week, and part of me thought I was just working myself up. I stayed. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I kept the lantern close, stayed dressed, knife in hand. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was the shed. A creaking noise like the door opening slowly. Then silence. I got up and moved to the window without turning on the light. The moon was bright enough to see a little, and the shed was about 30 yards from the cabin. I could just barely make out the door. It was open, wide open. I stared at it, waiting for movement, but nothing came out. I sat back down, trying to decide if I should go check. I told myself not to. I waited. Maybe 20 minutes passed. Then I heard the crunching again, this time much closer, right up against the cabin wall. Then a dragging sound. I stood still by the window, barely breathing. A few seconds passed. Then I heard 3 hard knocks on the side of the cabin wall. Not on the door, not even near it. Just solid, firm knocks on the outside wall near the window. My stomach dropped. I backed up, held the knife up without realizing, and waited. The knocks didn't come again. About 15 minutes later, I finally turned on the lantern and kept it by my side the rest of the night. Nothing else happened. No more steps.
No sounds.
But I didn't sleep. At first light, I threw everything back into my bag and went outside. I went to the shed slowly. The door was wide open, and the inside was exactly how I left it, except the stack of wood in the back corner had been knocked over. Not fallen. Knocked, like someone had stepped into it or kicked it. The lock was on the ground. Bent. Not rusted apart. Bent like it had been twisted. That was enough for me. I walked around the cabin one more time before I left. On the far side, beneath the window, I found more smudges. On the wood wall, a couple looked like finger marks. High up too, higher than I could reach without jumping. I didn't wait to make sense of any of it. I drove the 3 hours back home, didn't tell anyone what happened, and never went back. 3 weeks later, I finally mentioned it to my cousin Harold's daughter while we were catching up at a family gathering. I didn't go into detail. I just said I stayed at the cabin for a few days and something felt off. That's when she told me that back when Harold was alive, he used to find food missing from the shed sometimes. Once he found cigarette butts behind the woodpile. He figured it was just some local kid sneaking around or maybe a drifter. But after a while, it stopped. He never reported it, never told anyone, just locked the place up and stayed away after dark. I guess I know why now. I still don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was watching the cabin, maybe living in those woods, maybe using the shed, maybe just waiting, but I won't ever go back to find out. It was the summer of 2018, and I had taken a break from everything. I'd been working too much, barely seeing daylight, and after my father passed away that spring, something inside me said I needed to disappear for a bit. I booked a week away in a small cabin in Northumberland, up near Kielder Forest. I'd found the place through a listing online. No Wi-Fi, no mobile signal, just a basic wooden cabin by a tree-lined slope near an old stone fence and a field that rolled down into a valley. It looked old, maybe built in the 60s or 70s. The guy who rented it said it was mostly used in winter by hunters and the odd hiker, but it was free all summer. I drove up from Manchester in my old Vauxhall Astra, packed with supplies, a cooler, a gas stove, my sleeping bag, and a few paperbacks. I remember it was late afternoon when I finally found the narrow gravel road that led up into the woods. The trees on both sides were thick and tall, and even though it was sunny when I got there, the shadows under those trees made the whole place feel quiet in a heavy way. The cabin itself was small, maybe 20 feet long, with old wooden siding, a small front porch, and a single window facing out toward the trees. Inside, there was one room with a small table, a cot, a fireplace, and a cupboard that smelled like it hadn't been opened in years. No electricity. There was a hand pump outside for water, though I had brought plenty of bottled stuff with me too. The toilet was an outhouse about 30 meters away behind the cabin. That first night was peaceful. I made some food, sat outside on the porch, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The forest stretched down the hill and opened up toward the fields in the distance. It was quiet except for the sounds of insects and the occasional bird. I woke up the next morning to a light drizzle. It had turned gray overnight, and I stayed inside for most of the day reading and cooking. By evening, the rain had stopped, but the trees were dripping, and the air felt heavy. I walked around the area a bit before dark, trying to get a sense of my surroundings. The tree line went on in every direction, with only a faint path cutting down the slope toward a wire fence that bordered some farmland. That's when I noticed her for the first time. She was standing far off in the trees. I couldn't see her clearly, just a tall figure in a long coat, standing completely still about 50 or 60 yards away. I assumed it was someone from one of the nearby farms, maybe a hiker. I turned and walked back toward the cabin. I didn't think much of it then, only that it felt a little strange for someone to be standing in the woods that late and not moving. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to sounds, branches snapping, light thuds on the porch, the sound of leaves brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a fox, maybe wind, but I got up twice to check. I looked out the window both times and saw nothing. The trees looked like black silhouettes against the gray sky. The quiet felt unnatural. The next day, I hiked a bit down the slope to clear my head. I followed that path past the wire fence and into the field. The grass was high and damp, and I ended up circling back toward the road where my car was parked. It was still there, untouched. I walked back up the gravel path and sat on the porch for a while with my boots off, drying them out. Then I saw her again. She was farther off this time, up the ridge where the trees grew more tightly. I wouldn't have noticed her if I hadn't seen a flicker of motion. Not her moving, but the slight sway of her coat in the wind. She was facing me, just standing there. Still, I stared for a while. She didn't move. She didn't raise a hand or walk away. I felt uncomfortable in a way that didn't make sense. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't even on the cabin's land. But there was something off about how long she stood there, watching. I went inside and waited. Half an hour passed before I dared to peek out the window. She was gone. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. The lock on the door was old and loose, and even though I knew I was probably being paranoid, something didn't sit right with me. I kept the hatchet I brought for chopping kindling near my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not animals, not the wind, actual footsteps on the wooden porch. Slow and steady. I held my breath, heart pounding, trying not to move or make a sound. I couldn't see much from the window, but I sat up, peering through the edge of the curtain. Nothing. No one. I waited, still listening. The footsteps stopped. A few minutes later, I heard the pump outside creak. The handle moved. Someone was using it or pretending to. That sound went through me like ice. I stayed awake the rest of the night. When daylight came, I stepped outside carefully, holding the hatchet. Everything looked normal. But when I walked over to the water pump, I saw footprints in the mud. Bare feet, adult-sized, a little too wide, a little too long. The grass around the back of the cabin had been flattened like someone had walked circles there. That was it for me. I packed my things fast, stuffed them in the car, and locked the cabin out of habit even though I wasn't coming back. I drove into the nearest village, about 25 minutes away, and booked a room in a small inn. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I just said the cabin had a rat problem and I left early. I tried to sleep that night, but something still felt wrong. I kept thinking about the woman in the woods, the way she didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there watching. I even wondered if she'd followed me somehow, but that was too crazy. I told myself she probably lived nearby, probably wandered the woods often, probably had no clue I'd even seen her. The next morning, I went to the town library and looked through local history books. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe old stories, maybe something about that cabin or people living off-grid in the woods. I didn't find anything unusual. No missing persons, no weird reports, nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. A few days later, when I was back home, I went through the photos on my phone. I hadn't taken many out there, just a few shots of the forest and the field. But one of them caught me. A photo I didn't remember taking, and definitely didn't mean to. It was blurry, angled weird, like it had been taken from near the window inside the cabin. You could see part of the table, a corner of the cupboard, and just outside the window, the edge of a face, just part of it. Pale, long, with a wide eye and hair pressed flat against the glass. The timestamp said it was taken at 2:47 a.m., the night I heard the pump. I deleted the photo. I didn't want it on my phone. I didn't want to think about it. But I kept the hatchet under my bed for a long time after that. Every time I heard something outside at night, I'd remember that face in the window, and I'd wonder if she was still out there, walking the woods of Northumberland. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a real woman with nowhere to go and something wrong inside her. Something I didn't understand and never wanted to again.